No problem. Thank you, Tina. So thanks for joining us this morning. I just wanted to talk a bit more around what vulnerability management can do for you. I don't want this to be a product pitch on Tenable. There's a number of things we've seen changing in this particular market that we're in. It changes all the time, to be fair, but a lot more focus around how you're actually dealing with the information you have about vulnerabilities, how you're responding to them, and how that actually helps you be more proactive as an organization as well. When I was putting together the synopsis for this, it was at the time that we lost Terry Jones from Monty Python. If you're familiar with him, and it made me think very much along the lines of, when we talk to people about vulnerability management, it's, well, I do scanning, or I have Nessus, or I do this, or I do that. And people always think, so what's vulnerability management going to do that I'm not already doing? And it made me think of the classic People's Front of Judea, or Judean People's Front. What did the Romans ever do for us? And they all of a sudden come up with this very long list of really important, vital things that the Romans actually did for us. So we're not going to talk too much about Monty Python, but we want to try and give some context around what vulnerability management hopefully brings to the table for you. There's been probably quite a number of announcements already this year around particular vulnerabilities or exploits and compromises that have hit the news. I picked on a couple of them I wanted to talk about. For me, they're quite different in terms of how they've impacted the marketplace. The first one I wanted to talk to you about is Curveball. Or if you work for a vulnerability management vendor, you refer to these things as CVE 2020-0601 because we're very rock and roll here at Tenable. So the key thing with this particular vulnerability, so it was announced by Microsoft with Patch Tuesday releases mid-January. The vulnerability itself impacted the Crypt32 DLL, and it basically allowed a malicious actor or attacker to gain access to a system by impersonating a certified authority from something that Windows by default will trust, which includes Microsoft, but includes a number of others as well. What that enables you to do is make malicious code available from websites that will then automatically be accepted. The challenge with that is, if I can disguise malware as legitimate software, then it can very easily gain access and be deployed onto one of my systems. Or a good example with the phishing websites, stuff or code that may automatically get flagged as potentially malicious may not do so. Now, I said I wanted to call out a couple of things that are notable for different reasons. One of the key things for me with this vulnerability was how quickly people responded to it. So there is a patch for it. The patch was released on Patch Tuesday on the 14th of January. It only impacts actually the latest editions of Windows. Now, hopefully, most organizations have upgraded to these in terms of support, but other systems like Linux, Mac OS, if you're using those, they're not impacted to it. As you can see from the graph on the right-hand side of the screen, this actually tracks where we saw within scan results the occurrences of this vulnerability happening. Or very simply, you can see that from the point of detection on the 16th of January through to a week later, we were then seeing 49% of systems had been patched against this vulnerability. So people were able to take this information and respond quickly and get this rolled out into their systems. The bottom bullet I've got on here actually publicly disclosed by the NSA. It was, and this is unusual because the NSA don't typically publicly disclose vulnerabilities. They'll quite often operate behind the scenes with the vendors, as most vulnerability researchers would do, and notify them to get things moving. They saw this as so particularly critical that they went public with it as well. So that's an interesting thing moving into 2020, seeing security agencies as potentially the disclosures of vulnerabilities as well. The second one I wanted to talk about was Sodinokibi. Congratulations if you're able to pronounce that. I may have said it horrendously wrong. But again, CVE 2019-11-51-0. If you're familiar with how CVE references are made up, then 2019 is obviously then a vulnerability is identified in 2019. 11.5.10 is then the incremental number for that at the point of disclosure. Where this was interesting, so it's a critical vulnerability in the Pulse Secure VPNs. It basically meant that access can be gained to the network. You can gain access to clear text passwords, admin accounts, things like that, to be able to get onto a system and insert malware. So the Sodinokibi ransomware is the one that's been in the press in January. So the impact of this notably was TravelX. Early January, reports suggested they were held to ransom for $6 million, and there were claims that about 5 gig of data had been exfiltrated. From my point of view, this is a good example because Pulse Secure actually identified and notified customers of the vulnerability back quite early in 2019, and a patch was released in April 2019. It was August before the first exploit of this vulnerability was identified, which means that if you were up to date and releasing your patches and getting those deployed, then there's a very good chance you would have been defended against this vulnerability by the time an exploit was available in August. There was also, as a note, Sodinokibi also utilized a Microsoft vulnerability that they actually patched back in October 2018. So as you look at it, if you had good vulnerability data and you had good patch cadence, then in all likelihood, you should have been okay against this. The reason it's believed that TravelX was impacted the way they were, and they weren't the only organisation there, but TravelX obviously was the one that hit the news in the UK certainly, is because people weren't necessarily aware of exactly where the Pulse Secure software VPNs were deployed. So they may not have been aware as to whether they had patched all the ones they had or not. So kind of an environment visibility or discovery issue. At the point where the exploit was identified, there were about 14,000 public or internet-facing devices that were vulnerable. At the point of the TravelX compromise, then a similar scan was run, not by us, by third parties, and identified almost 4,000 devices still public or internet-facing that were vulnerable to this as well. So, some people had taken steps to respond, but a number still hadn't at that point as well. So, talking a bit more about what vulnerability management can do, we're moving in very quickly into a world where we now talk about risk-based vulnerability management. But just talking about vulnerability management itself for a moment, a lot of people think that because they do scanning, they're doing vulnerability management, and that isn't always the case. So vulnerability management is about looking at your environment. So a vulnerability scan will give you a long list of all the vulnerabilities and the systems they impact in your environment. But with vulnerability management, you want to look at the systems that are impacted and gain some context around those. So understanding if a vulnerability on a test device is as important to respond to as a vulnerability on a production device. Understanding if you have mission critical or line of business applications, that are more critical and have a bigger impact if they're taken down, and also making sure that maybe your scan frequency is different in terms of how you look at those devices. So maybe moving from a monthly or quarterly scan of everything to some more critical devices being scanned on a more regular, maybe weekly or fortnightly basis and things like that. One of the other elements of that as well is a lot of organizations will do vulnerability scanning, but when it comes to patching, they actually look at, if we pick on Microsoft, because it's always fun to pick on Microsoft, where they're patching based on System Center and the information that gives. But that's going to give you information about the Microsoft side of your estate, and it's not going to give you any information on the context of how you're using those applications. So Microsoft's view of what's critical may not necessarily be what's critical for you, or may not be what you need to go fix first. So I mentioned that our world is moving more to a risk-based conversation around these things. Traditional vulnerability management tends to have a number of manual processes in it. The reasons people are starting to look at it tends to be more from a compliance factor. There's certain regulatory requirements I have to meet, and this is how I need to meet them. That can be based on critical vulnerabilities based on CVSS needing to be remediated within a fixed period of time, like PCI or Cyber Essentials Plus, for example. So quite often we see from that point of view that there isn't necessarily a good schedule around how some of those assets are scanned and how regularly, and the types of scans and things like that. And ultimately, some of the context you might have based on your environment is looking at the fact that you may not be able to deal with everything critical in one go. So what do I need to go fix first based on what aspects of mine it actually impacts? A key thing here, and it kind of leads back to the pool secure issue, is do you actually understand all of the assets that you have? Are you able to do a proper network discovery and understand what assets are on your network? Do you have assets that are maybe no longer the traditional long life assets like servers, maybe virtual servers used to be, but you might have more containers, maybe some web applications and things that maybe have a shorter shelf life, and so may not be scanned as frequently, or may not get scanned at all. As that moves over to a more risk-based view, it's starting to combine essentially better context around your environment, also elements of threat intelligence, so understanding the exploits being available. Are those exploits being used and being seen in the wild? And as a result, having a critical vulnerability that can't be exploited may not be as important to go fix today as the critical vulnerability that can be exploited. That's not to say you don't fix it, but it's maybe tomorrow's problem, not today's. So it's looking at those sort of things. I always sort of say that with these things, anything like this, you have to break it down into bite-sized chunks because you can't fix everything in one go. So what should that first bite-sized chunk be? And that's where the traditional vulnerability management and risk-based vulnerability management are starting to come together to give that. We follow very typically a life cycle for these things. We think it's very important to make sure you can discover what you have in your environment, being able to gain visibility into what assets you have, what's on your network, what's connected to your switches, and what's sending traffic over your networks. Once you can see what you have, you then work out what type of assessments you need to run against those. This is essentially the scan element. What type of scan? Where can I be credentialed so I can authenticate onto the asset and look at it thoroughly? I always give the example here of if you are casing a house as a burglar, do you want to just look around the outside, or do you want to be able to see inside and see what's available in every room before you go in? And it's always the latter, ideally. So from an assessment point of view, That's the credentialed scan. That's being able to see the software footprint inside the asset, being able to look at the registry, being able to understand the configuration of the asset, not just what vulnerabilities may be there. Once you can gain that information, you put it into a management tool, and that management tool is where you gain some of that additional context, where that threat intelligence can be applied to the vulnerabilities, and where the context around the assets and the criticality they have for you can start to be applied inside the management console as well. Once you can do that, you can start to make decisions on what you remediate. Now, Tenable as a vendor, we don't do the remediation, but we give you the information you need in order to raise the necessary change controls and to drive that for you. And then we give you the ability to measure. So being able to go back and see what I just set out to remediate. Did it fix the vulnerabilities it was meant to? Sometimes patches come out from vendors and they don't always fix all the vulnerabilities that they're supposed to. So being able to make sure you can check that, and then the process starts again. Now that I fix these things, what are the next things I need to go do? So typically fitting this in alongside your patching cadence as well. So we think of this as kind of your scan to patch life cycle, which is scan, patch, rescan, validate, and so on, is where a lot of organizations are starting to move to. So I've highlighted a couple of areas there, and it might seem quite obvious that you need to gain that context and understand what you need to go patch first, because you can't do everything. But if that's the case, why isn't every organization doing it? And one of the things I'd say here is, based on what we see, a lot of the goalposts are always moving. As CVSS, for example, CVSS goes version 2 to version 3. What is a high-risk vulnerability? What is a critical vulnerability? That changes. If from a regulatory perspective, you're required to deal with everything critical, if CVSS changes and makes more of what's already out there critical than it was yesterday, then that changes how you respond and what you need to do. Things can change within your own organization as well, moving to more modern asset types like containers, web applications. It moves away from the traditional data center environment, which is relatively easy to understand what you have. So being able to make sure you can do discovery of your environment on an ongoing basis, not just a point in time now in February of what things look like, and maybe doing the same thing again in 6 months' time. This needs to be a more continual process as well. So this came from a Polymer Institute report released just over a year ago. And this highlighted a couple of areas. So down bottom right, only or less than a third of organizations believe they have enough visibility into their attack surface. So that's basically, the different types of assets they have. Do they understand what they have, and do they understand the impact of that, or the potential impact of that in terms of attack surface? Top left, security are spending more time on manual processes and not responding. So, good examples here are people only dealing with scan results. If you do a scan of, say, 300 assets, you're probably going to have somewhere in the region of 100 pieces of information per asset. You then have to start making a decision on what to go deal with first based on 30,000 lines in a spreadsheet. That's not practical, and it's not scalable. So that's where people end up with a backlog of what they need to do, and then by default they go to patching or updating what System Center says they need to patch or update first, or WSUS. So they're stepping then away from the context of their own environment. And then in terms of responding to vulnerabilities, how to deal with anything that might come out in terms of a compromise, that dreaded moment when the CISO knocks on the door and asks, how does this vulnerability impact us? Are we going to be the next Travelex? And you're not able to tell them because you don't have all the information that you need. And I mentioned as well, when you start moving towards a risk-based focus, a lot of organizations still aren't looking at threat intelligence. And actually, talking to some of the threat intelligence providers, we found that one of the reasons people don't do that is because threat intelligence about your vulnerabilities that's not included within the vulnerability assessment data is very difficult to deal with. So we're quite fortunate that we do include that within our software. But if you were to try and take a vulnerability threat intelligence feed independently, it can be very difficult to incorporate that into any results that you have. One of the things we looked at as well, and we introduced this last year, was a vulnerability priority rating. So that allows us to, in parallel to the CVSS score, is give you a score that looks very similar. It scores from 0 to 10, and it rates from critical, high, medium, low. But it looks at the likelihood of a vulnerability being exploited the next 28 days. What we've added to that is a criticality rating. So based on everything we know about your assets, and including some of the threat intelligence of things we see around those assets globally. So that can be things we're seeing around particular applications, how they're being used, whereabouts in your environment they may be. We can give you a criticality rating, essentially a score from 0 to 10, that allows you to marry these two things together. So now I can, trying to understand criticality of my own environment can be quite difficult. But if we can give you an estimate of what we think that is for all of your assets, and even if we're only kind of 85, 90% accurate, it's a lot easier to then go and manually adjust that 10% rather than having to manually do 100% as well. So being able to bring these things together starts to help overcome some of those challenges in terms of how you deal with the vulnerabilities in your environment. So just to give a good example of that VPR in action, this was a vulnerability from 2018. It was one that was used as we were building out and validating the model ourselves. But I think it's a good example because when the CV was first published, we were able to assign a VPR score to it. So we were able to look at a number of things, what it impacted. We were able to look at any information around exploit, any information around the impacted operating systems, any applications, and things like that as well. We actually have over 150 data points that feed into the model that gives us the VPR rating. You can see how a couple of them work here. So you can see within a couple of weeks, there was an exploit available. We'd see an activity on the dark web. That implies people are seeing the exploit available and are doing something with it. It may just be downloading it, but they're taking an interest. We then saw that tail off over the next few weeks, but then start to rise again. Quite often, if the vendor announces that they're going to release a patch, that causes a flurry of activity. And again, we often track that in terms of dark web activity and things as well. And then a CVSS score gets assigned to it. The CVSS score does not change over time. CVSS, the base score, gets given, it's assessed, and essentially a CVSS 3 score is probably unlikely to change until we get CVSS 4. And in fact, if you look at when CVSS 2 went to CVSS 3, there's a number of CVSS 2 vulnerabilities that weren't rescored for CVSS 3 anyway. The VPR, however, gets calculated every day. So those scores get updated every 24 hours. And if you're familiar with Tenable software, we use what we refer to as a plugin, which is a small piece of code that does a check for vulnerability or a check for configuration element of an asset. We have the VPR scores embedded into those, and we update them every single day. So as frequently as you update your plugins from Tenable, you will have the latest VPR scores available. To give some additional context there, obviously you saw on that previous slide, it was about 10 weeks before the CVSS was assigned. This is the Curveball vulnerability. This was rated CVSS v3 as a high-risk vulnerability at 8.1. As you can see, under CVSS version 2, it was a medium-risk vulnerability. But from a VPR point of view, we flagged this as a 9.4. So our customers were getting alerted that this was in their systems. in their environment, and they needed to respond to it. So I kind of give you an idea of sort of what adding that threat intelligence and adding a more risk-centric view of the potential impact of the vulnerability can do. So we've talked about sort of vulnerability management, the differences between that and scanning. We've touched a little bit on the risk-based side of things. So I just wanted to go into that a little more. As you can see from the image on the screen, you know, as you get in the car every day, we all obviously do our standard daily checks that we're supposed to, of checking oil, checking tires, and things like that. But understanding that if your tire treads are too low, if the sort of conditions you're going to drive in, you become very conscious that, you know, getting your tires replaced may be a priority that you need to do. And, you know, you may not want friends and family going out in a car where the tires may need to be replaced. So it's fairly obvious that, you know, you put some priority yourself in getting these things fixed. So it's only right that, you know, we want to have that same level of diligence around the IT environments that we're responsible for as well. So just an expansion on the slide I showed previously. One of the reasons risk-based vulnerability management is becoming more key is actually coming from the top down. So from a C-level point of view, they're very focused on potential risk to the business. That comes in a number of areas. The IT risks to the business, or the IT security risks to the business, are starting to become more of a concern, or certainly being able to get better understood at C-level or board level than they maybe were a few years back. But that changes how we need to do things. How you communicate you know, the vulnerabilities that need to be dealt with is not the same way as you'd communicate how that could impact or add additional risk to the business. So how these things get looked at needs to change. Understanding that overall risk, understanding that you need to respond to that, but also in a lot of areas, it's about being able to take an end-to-end view of how you deal with vulnerability management, being able to look at those different areas. So I gave the example earlier of different types of scans. So I've been in a number of situations where you talk to customers about, you know, what are you doing about vulnerability management? And there's someone who very confidently says, oh, we scan everything every 2 weeks. But what you might want to be able to do is do some analysis of that to make sure, are you scanning with the right types of scans? Are you authenticating where you need to be? Are there assets that you can't authenticate to, but you still scan them via the network or scan them externally, and being able to understand that? And are there more critical assets that actually you need to be scanning more frequently? And also your patch cadence may need to be more frequent for those assets as well. So being able to do that analysis typically shows up that there's always areas you can improve the internal processes. So this is not about you know, me from Tenable trying to find ways of selling you more product. This is about doing that analysis of how you deal with the day-to-day operations of what you do, and find those areas to tweak a little here, improve a little there, and overall improve that risk posture, and being able to communicate that back to the business as why these changes were important to do starts to become very key. So there's a few areas you may be familiar with. These are hopefully a number of things that you do today. So, you know, vulnerability management, key driver for a lot of people looking at it is based on compliance. But in some organizations, that is the tick box. You know, PCI compliance is probably a good example. We just want to make sure we are PCI compliant. But there's a number of organizations who've been compromised in the past who've been fully PCI compliant. But payment cards information, transaction details and things like that have actually been compromised. So it's now moving more towards a risk-driven view. So you still have to be compliant to the regulatory standards, but you may need to go above and beyond when you do that. So if something happens, if your environment gets impacted, how quickly and how able are you in terms of responding to that, getting those patches rolled out, and making sure the most critical assets are patched first, but the other assets that need to be patched also get patched within the same window. So prioritizing within everything you have to do, not just trying to make sure you do the most important things. Starting to look more at the more modern asset types, web apps. How do you look at those? A lot of organizations now, it was only a few years ago that you went from deploying physical to being VM first. You deploy things as virtual machines before you did anything else. Now it's a case of organizations are taking things as a web app. They're taking things as an online service or cloud-based service before they start looking at deploying things internally. So are you able to scan and understand any potential exposure you have there? So I won't go through the whole slide, but key one then is helping you make sure you're being more proactive rather than just reactive, trying to make sure you can see things and patch them maybe before the CVSS score is available. And rather than just looking at those long lists of vulnerabilities, but being able to look at that asset criticality, combine that with the threat intelligence of some of my most critical assets are actually at risk of being exploited, so I need to go deal with those first. So it's building all of those things into that vulnerability management process that you have. So it won't come as a great surprise that Tenable are amazing at this. So we've had a few reports out at the end of last year that we're number one in coverage. So that means we will help you cover more asset types in your environment than anyone else. We will give more coverage of vulnerabilities than anyone else. And you can see on the right-hand side, that's over 54,000 at the moment. We actually have over 38,000 plugins, because they're not just all checking for vulnerabilities. Some of them are checking for configuration elements, because when you do a vulnerability assessment and you're trying to understand the impact anything could have in your environment, understanding any configuration elements that may need to be changed on those assets or configuration issues is really key as well. I talked about, combining the threat intelligence. We do take data from 8 third-party threat intelligence organizations, but we have our own vulnerability research team as well. And that across 2019, I think the actual figure at the end of the year was 138 vulnerabilities discovered by us. We obviously notify the relevant vendors of those vulnerabilities, and we have a disclosure process that we follow that is public. But compared to some of the other vendors in our space, most of the others were still in single digits at the end of 2019 in terms of what their own vulnerability research was doing. And it's kind of, I always think with these things, if that's what they're doing, that's feeding into their product. I look at what we're doing and think, that's what's feeding into our product. That's giving customers a significant advantage. You don't pay extra for that either. That's part and parcel of the standard kind of enterprise licenses as well. And typically our time to respond. So you saw with that example I gave of the Linux vulnerability that in under 24 hours from a CVE being identified, we will have a VPR score covering it. Also, when vulnerabilities like that are discovered, typically once that data is there, it is made publicly available and other vendors can use it as well. So part of the overall ecosystem of vulnerability management, there are elements of collaboration that take place as well. And you don't just have to take my word for it. Some of those reports last year came out. A notable one was from Forrester. Now, officially, I'm only allowed to tell you that it means we are a leader in the vulnerability risk management space, but we are on the top right. So I will let you infer from that what you will. But one of the big things we've seen change is Gartner have started towards the end of last year talking much more significantly about risk-based vulnerability management and the impact that they believe it will have to people who take a vulnerability risk management approach. Essentially, they're saying if you're not, you're still likely to be compromised. If you look at sort of some of the breaches that happened over the last couple of years, some of those customers did have a vulnerability management program. It may not have been tied into their patching and their patch management. So although they're aware of what vulnerabilities they have, they weren't necessarily remediating them. So the focus starts to move much more to making sure that you understand the risks and are able to respond to those risks effectively as an organization as well. But it's always good to finish on an analyst reference. That's kind of it from me. So over to any questions.